Good afternoon, Tat Kalawat. My name is Jennifer Karson Engum. I've been the applied anthropologist for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla since 2003, initially with Tomaslik Cultural Institute and then later with the Cultural Resources Protection Program, housed in the Department of Natural Resources for the CTUIR since 2009. In both locations, I work in the documentation and interpretation. That's ethnographic and historical, which includes the oral history of the tribes, and of plateau tribal history and culture in general. I also serve as the NAGPRA coordinator within CRPP. I'm not going to explain NAGPRA today, but if there's a raise of hands after, I can, for those who don't know. So the Willamette the Umatilla Shlama, Kawalulapam, that's the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people, have traveled throughout the Northwest, including to Willamette Falls, to exercise their traditional rights to gather the first foods since time immemorial. A lot of what I'm saying today is going to echo what Jeremy has said and a little of what Greg said, although the differences that are very unique among and between Columbia River tribes. So, since time immemorial, that's a term that defines a time before history was recorded, in a sense that we know it today, history being a written documentation. Previous forms of history were through oral repetition, so in a way, if I'm mirroring or repeating what Jeremy or what Greg has said, then that's actually culturally appropriate. Through oral repetition, history was documented among tribes. Tribal members continue to this tradition today of gathering the lamprey here annually to bring them back to the larger reservation community for subsistence purposes. So the first food of the lamprey, the first foods were described a little bit. The table is feasted in order of those foods, the first being water of the first foods. The first sip and the last sip around the first foods meal is water. The first animal, the salmon, was the first to give his life for the people. And that's at a time, historically, for tribal folks in the Columbia River system. That was the time before people were here, when the animals could speak. So thinking about the first foods, when you think about the way Jeremy was describing it, and how those foods are on the land today, and where those foods were, is what the people ate, but also how the people identified themselves and intimately tied to tribal religion, those first foods. The ancient practice of fishing for salmon and all the other species and for gathering and harvesting lamprey is passed down from generation to generation and is a fundamental tenet of the tribal religion, as I'm saying. The intertribal areas for fishing and trade were found at significant sites in the Columbia Basin, such as at the Willamette Falls, at Celilo Falls, and at Kettle Falls, in the Upper Columbia, and at other sites. Confluences of rivers were also extremely significant places. So when you think about the river as a system, there's a couple of organizations, EcoTrust being one of them, that's done an interesting mapping project years and years ago called Salmon Nation, turned it into a little book. That followed the salmon on a naturalist life system all the way up to Alaska and back down to the mouth of the Columbia, then all the way up the Columbia and up the tributaries, and mapped that. So that being its own nation for the salmon. So there are interesting ways to think about the Columbia River and its tributaries as more of a larger cultural context for this site right here, this fishing site of Willamette Falls. So let's see, where am I? These intertribal areas. Well, people from the CTUIR, among others on the Columbia River, traveled to Willamette Falls for subsistence purposes and for trade, and at times for less friendly purposes. A little bit of warring occurred. It was a nice stopping off point on your way to Klamath and Shasta country, where you would go get your slaves. Dead room. Okay. So that was also part of the culture. So these intertribal trade places were important. People were and are social animals without the ability to produce everything for themselves. While the land and the landscape produced the foods, all of the intertribal networking was also part of that process along the seasonal round migration route. So movement to other areas within the culture area of the Columbia Plateau was also imperative to survival. Movement was fluid up and down the rivers and the trails and travel corridors. Tribal people will tell you, we all use the resources of this land. No one was to the exclusion of the other. So it makes you think about layers, as we've been talking about in the designs. Before Interstate 84, if you peel that back, you had the Oregon Trail. Well, the Oregon Trail followed the Indian trails. The Indian trails followed the game trails, and all of it really started with the foods. So before I-84, the Oregon Trail, before the Oregon Trail, Columbia River. Similarly, you could sort of think of the Oregon Trail and the I-5 corridor paralleling the earlier movement of indigenous people up and down the Willamette River. Historic importance, that's hard to measure. It's easier to qualify in terms of a time continuum from the beginning to the present. So that's kind of a long history. With no delineation between prehistory, history, and prehistory, there are contact eras in various forms with non-Indian folks. One can speak about times as pre or post-contact, but in terms of history, leaving Native folks in the past is not an accurate way to think about the presence of indigenous people. They're still here, they've always been here, they will continue to be here because this is home. But contact is an interesting historical era. Clothing and other items often arrived through trade before people did. Explorers, missionaries, traders, and immigrants all brought change. Contact with the Northwest Company and Hudson Bay Company intensified the movement up and down the rivers by systematically incorporating tribes like Cayuse and Walla Walla in particular into the trade system, with Fort Vancouver as the main hub of activity. And so it's interesting, the oral history program at the CTUIR, we have over 500 oral histories. There are some families that can trace their ties almost specifically. They are Cayuse descendants of McLaughlin himself. Gone to a couple of family reunions. So thinking about the history of intermarriage brought in by trade as a systematic approach by those traders is also part of the tribal history. So tribal cultural continuity has remained throughout. And when you think about fishing, which includes harvesting lamprey, the oldest species, the elder of these species, has been there for so long and so resilient. So that cultural continuity and the ties to the foods, those elders, that did not cease at Willamette Falls for the CTUIR or the other tribes from earlier times to today. 114 years ago, the United States Supreme Court described tribal fishing like this: the right to resort to the usual and accustomed fishing places in controversy was a part of larger rights possessed by the Indians, upon the exercise of which there was not a shadow of impediment, and which were not much less necessary to the existence of the Indians than the atmosphere they breathed. This quote is from United States versus Winans, 1905, a pivotal fishing rights decision from the early 1900s on tribal rights to cross over private lands to fish. Also standing for the proposition that treaties, sorry to do a little treaty history here, but nobody brought it up, so here I am. So also standing for the proposition that treaties were not a grant of rights to tribes, but a grant of rights from tribes to the United States, and a reservation of those rights not granted. So in other words, several rights have been inferred from treaties, including water rights, both surface and groundwater. Tribes granted the U.S. rights to lands they ceded, but the tribes reserved rights to the lands that they specifically did not grant to the U.S. Rights such as the ability to access those lands that they hunt, fish, gather, and graze on. Other rights as sovereigns the tribes retained were the rights to make their own laws and be governed by them, and to define their own membership criteria. What is important is that the U.S. didn't give the tribes anything in the treaties. the tribes gave rights to the U.S. You'll often hear that the U.S. gave the tribes treaty rights, which is simply not true. So just correcting that little myth. The tribal right to hunt and fish pre-existed the U.S., therefore, how could the U.S. give the tribes those rights? Our interest in this area and in this project is foremost that tribal rights and resources under the Treaty of 1855 be protected and continue no matter what happens here. And as future development in phase 1 through 8 at Willamette Falls becomes a reality, we'll be at the table, maybe not me, so my children, tribal people, 7 generations behind us. Our involvement does not constitute acceptance of the project, but we see participation as crucial to the ongoing process of this proposed project and these plans. So the C2IR, we've participated in the Willamette Falls Legacy Project since about 2014, I think. They keep throwing me over to the side of the Cascades as technical staff, and I just bring, right, as I've always told Brian, I just take my notes and bring it back. I told Christina that too. As a member of the tribal working group, we've been at the table. It's been nice to be there, attending meetings, engaging in discussion, assisting in correcting and editing the cultural landscape draft report, which is an honor to work on. And then we returned the invitation. The Willamette Falls Legacy Project staff came to the CTUIR in 2016, somewhere abouts. Met with, the purpose was to present to the governing bodies, way above me. The Board of Trustees, the Cultural Resources Committee, and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Among the concerns of the Fish and Wildlife Commission was privacy. They were kind of wary of the fishbowl effect that may occur, and especially at harvest time. So the privacy of the fishing site and any potential damage to lamprey due to the lighting. That's kind of their one fear. So there's others that can speak to that species and to that concern better than me, but that's that point, especially at night. Among the concerns of the Cultural Resource Commission was the potential harm to the falls as a traditional cultural property of the tribes, all the Columbia River and tribes in this region, and any ground disturbing activity incurred by the proposed project. So that's the CRC and the Cultural Resources Protection Program. They've been awaiting the Army Corps of Engineers Section 106 process. Slow as molasses, but that's okay. That process will begin in order to engage in a deeper, more meaningful consultation that's actually federally mandated. So, and lastly, interpretation. At the site here, our involvement in interpretation is absolutely necessary. It's tribes, more than stakeholders, are excited to be partners in the discourse and putting together the cultural narrative that goes with the educational outreach that's lasting here. So that relationship with local governments to engage with C2IR in researching the location of, in particular, something important, and that's why I looked at Brian with knowing where the bodies were. Something important to the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla are the whereabouts of the Cayuse 5. Those that would like more information on that history and that story, you could probably read the Cultural Landscape Draft, or Uyaka'ayat, Uyaka'aun, as days go by. It's a tribal history book. And that story, of course, ended here in Oregon City, but it began all the way up the river in the Walla Walla Valley. So the location of those 5 elders, those 5 leaders, hopefully for their protection and potential repatriation. The Willamette Falls area is part of this larger story of the Cayuse 5, of the lamprey, of history, trade, intermarriage, tribal movement throughout the plateau. It's a history that's alive today. It's not in the past. And treating that, in particular, the Cayuse 5 story with the amount of sensitivity that it is due within the Legacy Project's intended narrative and interpretation is a priority for the C2IR. Deindustrializing this site, uncovering the layers that's been talked about a little bit, that seems to decolonize the back and forth relationship, so that's also seems to be happening naturally, which I think is very promising. And it models also the First Foods Management Plan that the C2IR has been engaged in. So within the Department of Natural Resources of the tribes, we work regularly with federal, state, and local agencies. But with our design of the management plan, we bring the non-Indian into the indigenous purview instead of the other way around, somewhat decolonize that relationship in the process. So this seems like a natural course of action as well for that same exercise. Thank you very much.